So here we are in Wargame Red Dragon. I'm just going to give you some advice on the basics of building a deck. I mean, I'm no expert, but we'll just go through the sort of things which I consider when I'm trying to make my decks. So the first thing you have is logistics. We'll assume, for the sake of talking about it, that you're going to play with one of the more complete nations with a complete set of units if possible, and we won't worry about the time and date and the specialization because you can consider that later. For your basic deck, you want a command, and my general advice is you probably want one infantry command and one armoured command, either a tank or an APC. A lot depends on your approach. I don't tend to go for the helicopter commands because they're very fragile and very easy to shoot down. You can always send a man in a helicopter and he can move to a safer location, so generally I find that's better. Or you can have a man in a vehicle. So generally what I go with is I go with a command vehicle like the Larv, and I go for some infantry. In this case I'll try going with the Huey, I guess. Generally, for an all-purpose deck like this, it's a good idea to have a forward operating base so you can supply your men. And you'll also want to have some supply trucks to bring a delivery. You can either bring a bigger truck which carries more supply, or a smaller truck which carries less, but obviously you can get more of them and they're cheaper. I generally go for the smaller ones because you can always call more in if you need them. And if you have the option, a helicopter supply can be very useful because sometimes your forces will be isolated, but you need to get supply to them quickly, and only a helicopter can pull that off. So that would be my sort of advice for a basic set of logistics units, and you've seen that with my other decks. That generally I go for a combo along these lines: some sort of armoured command, an infantry command, forward operating base, cargo jeeps, cargo helicopter. In terms of infantry, it's important to have a balanced set of infantry, because only infantry can invest towns properly, and they can form a vital part of any defence or attack. So generally, what you want is you want one anti-air unit. So you can remember you can compare the units using a pin unit for comparison. So you can select the Red Eye and compare it with the Stinger. And here you can see that the Stinger is better, if slightly more expensive. So you'll definitely want to bring one anti-air. One thing to consider is that normally you'll want your infantry to be in similar vehicles. So in this case, I'll probably go with a Humvee, because if you look at the speeds, the Humvee, out of the vehicles rather than the helicopters, is probably the quickest, even though it has less armour. So I guess I'll bring the Stinger Cs. Now the veteran C is important. The higher, the more accurate. I've got the more accurate Stinger, so I can probably afford to have the less veteran unit. They will level up if they're successful. The next thing you need is some ATGM. In the case of America, actually, this isn't fantastic. I think the light riflemen are pretty much what you have to go with. And they use the Dragon, which is not the best. However, you need these to deal with enemy tanks near towns, and to pick off enemy vehicles as they're coming towards you in the distance. So we'll take a unit of riflemen in a Humvee as well. In this case, we'll get hardened ones, so that they get the improved accuracy. You can see here that this level of experience gives them plus 16% accuracy, which is useful. And then what you want is some basic infantry. So in this case, I'll probably go with the riflemen, and I'll get the hardened ones. The more elite your units, the less of them you generally get. It's a rule of thumb. If you look at the other available units, it can be good to have a sort of elite shock unit. If you look at these guys, and you look at their training, these guys all have regular training. So if we select them, you see regular. Now you can get shock or elite, which are both better. So we could bring some Marines who are shock trained units, or we could bring some Delta Force units. Now having a Delta Force unit in a helicopter can actually be quite good. However, quite often you can get a recon version, like the Navy SEALs, I guess, in this case. In this case, I think we'll probably bring a Delta Force unit in a Chinook, an elite unit, and they can serve to go and capture objectives ahead of our forces and secure them, and also give us a bit of line of sight. And then for sort of raiding a position, having some shock units can be good. And in this case, I guess we'll bring some US Marines 90s in the LVTP. So that's an infantry force. The most important thing is that you have one of each type. So at the very least you need to have an anti-air, a normal infantry and an ATGM unit. Now we've moved on to support. So support is absolutely critical and it can be overlooked. The most important thing is your anti-air. Ever since Airland Battle, I mean, you're not going to win any battles without some very good anti-air. So it's normally important to bring at least one radar, such as the Hawk. This is the best Hawk. And one non-radar, so an infrared, like the Chaparral. Oops, I bought more than one. And generally you also want a AAA unit. And ideally you don't want it to be radar, though you can use the radar ones. So the advantage of this is your radar unit has the longest range and generally is the best at taking down planes, but it can be taken out by the SEAD aircraft. The infrared ones have a shorter range, but they can't be hit in the same way. And then, if you have the radar AAA, it can still be hit by the SEAD, but you can use that as a distraction. However, the Vulcan won't be hit. AAA has the advantage that it can stun aircraft, allowing the other weapons to take it out. And additionally, it's much better at taking out the helicopters, so if there's a heli rush, they're what's going to save you. So we'll bring some of them. In this edition, your artillery has been improved, so they have better accuracy than the old version of the game. So ideally what you want to do is you want to look at the sort of stats and decide which sort of gun you prefer. I tend to like the ones with just good range, so I can potentially counterfire the artillery, so I don't tend to go for lots of packed artillery. So I would bring a trained M110A2 in this case. So I've still got space for one more unit, and I would bring an additional missile unit, if possible. Maybe one which is more abundant. Yeah, so like 7 basic Chaparrals maybe, or 7 Hawks. Probably the 7 hardened Chaparrals. Just because you will lose a lot of anti-air, it will be targeted to try and make gaps in your defense, allowing the enemy aircraft to just decimate your forces. In terms of tanks, what I generally go with is if you have a heavy tank which is good, like the Abrams, then it's generally worth bringing it. So if you look at the available tanks, I'll probably bring the one down from the best elite tank in this case, though you can easily go for the best if you prefer. And then a medium tank. So the heavy tanks are sort of in a range of, 120 to 200 points. A medium tank I consider to be somewhere between sort of 70 and 100. So in this case, the M60A1 is pretty decent, but I'd probably go for the Super M60 or the MBT. I'm quite a fan of the MBT from the old games. I haven't actually played much to the US, but I think if it's still as good as it was, it'll do a good job. And then you want a light tank. And the idea of the light tank is just you can use it to support your infantry, basically. It's a cheap unit which can come and give them the extra bit of fire support to help them deal with light vehicles and infantry rushes against them. So an absolutely critical role now is recon, and in Wargame it's very important to have good recon. And my approach is generally what you need is at least one helicopter, one vehicle, and one infantry unit. And generally I would bring an elite recon unit as well. Although in this case I might not, because I'm not a huge fan of that strange Hawk gun the Navy SEALs have been given. So the longbow is an absolutely amazing recon, very expensive, but it has Hellfire missiles, which is pretty amazing on something which can see a very long way. Has exceptional optics. The optics is important, though you don't always need exceptional. If you have very good and a high level of veterancy, it's just as good as having an exceptional with a lower level of veterancy, quite often. So the recon unit, I would bring a basic recon helicopter as well, as a cheap alternative. So maybe the Kiowa. And some basic recon infantry on foot. In this case I'm probably not bringing the Navy SEALs, so I would potentially bring the Lav Scout. Bit of hardened recon available that way. So generally just a helicopter, infantry, and vehicle scout. So you have one for each sort of situation. I mean, your recon helicopter might get picked off because generally they're quite obvious. Your infantry don't stand up well under fire and obviously are quite slow. Whereas the scout can travel with the main force if you are attacking. Okay, then we move on to vehicles. In general, the main role of the vehicle units are either to bring a sort of napalm tank. I don't know if we have one in this set. I don't know if America gets one. Oh no, this one is. The Zippo is one. Which helps you clear forests and sometimes towns, though I haven't seen it with the towns yet in the game. But the general role is to bring ATGM. For example, these towels are very good. And it's a good idea to compare the accuracy and AP power of the different guns before getting them. You want the best normally, because there's not much point firing the missiles if they miss, because the unit can't move and fire the missile generally. They aren't fire and forget. But a good towel is very good. So I'll probably get the Humvee, and having that extra accuracy can make a big difference. Maybe a cheap option as well. Maybe a more expensive one. Can be hard to judge, but some ATGM is important. And then what you can also bring is a lot of nations, but not all, have a vehicle which is capable of firing at aircraft and helicopters, such as here, the M163CS. And these can be good for those moments where you run into the heli rush, basically, which sometimes you're going to run into in pub games at least. They can provide support in general against helicopters and infantry, but the main role is just to counter the helicopter rushes for me. I mean, other people may use them differently. There are also sort of infantry fighting vehicles like the Zippo, which some people bring, but I don't tend to try and rely on those. They can do a good job though. So move on to helicopters. So you've got sort of the amazing all-rounder helicopters like the Apache up here, and it can be good to have them if you have the time to micromanage them perfectly. And the other thing you want is a sort of gunship which has rockets to stun the enemy and potentially ATGM to pick off vehicles. So the Cobras tend to be quite good. I always used to get them in the old game, and I would get them here as well. Now, other things which can be quite useful are things like there's anti-air helicopters, like the OH-58CS, and I would bring this, and the idea being that you can sometimes counter an attack by enemy trying to land their infantry with helicopters, or you can use them to try and pick off recon helicopters. And they're not too expensive; they're cheaper than your planes, so they're well worth bringing, I think. Finally, it can be good to bring some very cheap helicopters, which are anti-men, like the Hogs and the Little Bird, but in this case I'm not bringing one. You can see the costs are going up, and I probably want to bring some aircraft as I'm the US. US get the unique Nighthawk, which is probably my favourite, so I'll definitely bring one. But the thing you want is, you want at least one bomber. Well, in general, I want one bomber, one seed bomber, and one fighter, at least. So if we look, the fighter is that symbol. So if we look along, we've got the F-16 block, and the Eagle. There's some cheaper options as well, I think. But I can't see them. But yeah. So I think I'll probably bring in some trained Eagles. And I think the Thunderbolt is generally considered to be the better option for the seed aircraft. As you can see, I'm very short on points, but then the US, you get more of a bonus the weaker the nation is, essentially. So you have to be more selective with the more powerful nations like the US or the USSR. So there we go, I've got one bomber, one fighter, and a seed aircraft. So that's the sort of basic set. Sometimes it can be good to bring a cheap bomber, or a cheap fighter, for various purposes. So naval they haven't fleshed out yet, but so I can't really advise you on what to bring. You've got various options like deep sea and coastal and so on. And at the moment I'm just assuming, from the way the rest of the game works, that it's a good idea to bring a balanced set of each. We will see in time how it actually works out. And hopefully I'll show some videos, and maybe I'll revise this once I've had a good look at it. But you can see there's various units available, although I'm not entirely sure how they're going to make it all work. And yeah, so you've got aircraft here with the anti-ship missiles, so I'm assuming that the normal airplanes aren't going to be able to hit ships, which I imagine is going to be very annoying. There you go. So that's my advice. Think of trying to keep every area, every category balanced, because it's very important to have the sort of combined arms in this game, and try not to leave any area too under-equipped. I mean, if you fail to bring enough anti-air, the enemy will probably kill you with aircraft. If you fail to bring enough infantry, you're going to struggle to break through towns. and so on. I mean, there are ways around it, and you can specialize your decks, but basic rules for a beginner, I would suggest this sort of deck. So yeah, let me know what you think and any other advice you have for deck building, and maybe I'll revise this at a later date. So here we are in Wargame Red Dragon. I'm just going to have give you some advice on the basics of building a deck. I mean, I'm no expert, but we'll just go through the sort of things which I consider when I'm trying to make my decks. So the first thing you have is logistics. We'll assume, for the sake of so generally what I go with is I go with a command vehicle, like the Larv, and I go for some infantry. In this case, I'll try going with the Huey, I guess. Generally, for an all-purpose deck like this, it's a good idea to have a forward operating base so you can supply your men. And you'll also want to have some supply trucks to bring a delivery. You can either bring a bigger truck which carries more supply, or a smaller truck which carries less, but obviously you can get more of them and they're cheaper. I generally go for the smaller ones, because you can always call more talking about it that you're going to play with one of the more complete nations with a complete set of units if possible, and we won't worry about the time and date and the specialization because you can consider that later. For your basic deck, you want a command, and my general advice is you probably want one infantry command and one armoured command, either a tank or an APC. A lot depends on your approach. I don't tend to go for the helicopter commands because they're very fragile and very easy to shoot down. You can always send a man in a helicopter and he can move to a safer location, so generally I find that's better. Or you can have a man in a vehicle.